Namoki has just released a new case to their lineup, which they're calling the Fathoms, which is an obvious homage of the 50 Fathoms from Blancpain. They sent me in the parts to do the build, and I love doing that because I can give you guys my thought process behind watch building. This way, if you're attempting to do it yourself, it's something that I always recommend because it gives you an added layer and perspective into watchmaking and watch building altogether, and it helps you understand the parts even more so. And that can carry over into servicing small details into your own watch, and you have so much fun interchanging parts and changing out small things along the way. There will be an affiliate link down below, which I get a small kickback, and it does help support the channel moving forward for me to continue to do these videos and give you guys my thoughts and my experiences so you can benefit if you try to attempt it yourself. So with that being said, without further ado, let's take a look at this build. So the very first thing that I like to do is wind the movement, test the movement, just to make sure that it's running and it's keeping at least decent time, at least within the standard of the factory settings. I have my time graph here. I'm just testing out the movement. Everything looks good. So I'm going to start organizing the parts. I'm lining everything up, just getting a good look at what I'm going to be assembling here. Sometimes I put them in order in which they're going to be assembled all together. So the Namoki made this nice Blancpain 50 Fathoms type of case. The case itself didn't come with the crystal, so the first thing we're going to do is a crystal press into it. I'm going to give you guys a couple of tips on that. You do want to be careful when pressing the crystal into the case because too much force at a wrong angle into the case can in fact crack the crystal, and that's something that we want to prevent altogether. So we want to make sure that we have the crystal right side up. This is a double dome with a top hat, and then we're finding an actual press piece that's going to fit the crystal nice and snug. I'm putting an extra layer here just to protect the dial a little bit, and then I'm going to be pressing down. I'm not forcing it as hard as I can. In fact, I'm pressing it down, and then I'm just rotating the actual case around little by little and just kind of wedging the actual crystal into place before I give it a final push. This way I make sure that it's going in nice and even, reducing the possibility of cracking the crystal itself. After you're done pressing the crystal in, you want to inspect to make sure it is in fact sitting inside of the case in all angles around the circumference of the actual crystal itself. Everything looks good, everything looks even, so we can move on to the next part. The next part is actually getting the dial onto the movement itself. So I'm going to throw this in a Ziploc really quickly just to prevent less cleaning later on from dust settling in there while we're working on the actual dial to the movement itself. Very careful when I'm taking the dial out of this casing. I'm handling it very gently. Everything on the actual dial itself is rather fragile, so you see me using that pegwood just to coax it out of the actual casing itself. And then we're going to remove the dial feet that coincide with what goes into the actual movement itself. You'll recognize this by looking at where the holes are on the actual movement holder itself. I'm always double checking which actual dial feet I have to remove. I always measure like 3 or 4 times. I'm a little paranoid because once you remove those dial feet, you can't put them back. And the way I like to remove the dial feet is I just grab them with a tweezer. I give them a little bit of a wiggle, and normally they'll just snap off. Sometimes you'll get lucky and they'll snap off pretty flush, but most of the time you'll have to do some filing. Now, when you file down, you want to file down where it's just flush and you don't have a bump. You don't want to file too less and there's still a material left over, but you don't want to file too much to where you're just taking off unnecessary material. You're handling the dial additionally where you really shouldn't really need to. And once you're able to make both of the feet cuts very even, you want to clean off the area with some Rodico. I use also a blower to clean the area. The Rodico will lift off any additional particles. Then you see me using the blower there. I shouldn't have been using it close to the movement as you see in the background, but it is what it is. This is the actual dial. Again, it's a homage of a 50 Fathoms. We see the no radiation at the 6 o'clock, the Namoki logo at the 12 o'clock, faux patina on there. Very nice. This is something you might have to do as well. Sometimes the dial feet are a little crooked. and it'll prevent you from getting one or the other dial feet in there. So I always just bend them just to make sure that they're straight before actually applying it. When you are applying the dial to the movement, you want to make sure that you are going on straight and those dial feet are not going to interact with the date wheel itself, because you'll scratch off the numbers. So just take your time, line it up. Sometimes you have to give it a little bit of a push. Now, when you're pushing the dial down, you want to make sure you're pushing only on the edge itself. The less interaction you have with the indices and everything else in the middle, the better. And it's really not necessary for you to push from the middle, as the edging of the dial itself is all that is necessary. You want to go around the dial when you're actually putting it flush to the movement, but you want to avoid making any contact at all with that balance wheel. That is by far the most fragile part of the watch. It's not covered by anything unless the rotor's actually over it. So when you're pushing down on the edge, just make sure that you're aware of where the balance wheel is sitting so you don't press it down. After you get the dial onto the movement itself, you're ready to start installing the hands. Now, because this has a date complication, you want to install the hands right when the date transitions over at the 12. This way you know where to line up your hands. Now, if that's not the case on your watch, then you just want to make sure that the hour hand is lined up with the minute hand. So this is how I like to do it. I line up the hour hand with some Rodico, and I put it straight at the 12 o'clock. Then I use pegwood just to line it up a little bit more, and after which I push down with the actual hand installation tool. Again, if you're going to make this kind of adjustment, just be very cautious not to scrape the dial itself with the pegwood as well, or any tool for that matter. I'm always very, very cautious, and I'm using a very light hand when I'm doing this. I like to give the hour hand another spin around the clock just to make sure that it is transitioning over when that hour hand meets the 12 o'clock position. Your mileage will vary depending on how straight you want it to be and how easy it is for you to do the hand installation and remove them. That's up to you. I always recommend when you're installing hands that if it's close enough where it's not going to bother you, just leave it alone. The more you uninstall hands and reattach them, the higher chance you have, especially if this is one of your first times doing builds, to actually damaging the hands altogether, and especially with the second hand being the most fragile part. So again, once we get that minute hand on, I'm giving it another spin around the clock. Now, when it comes to the minute hand and transitioning over to the 12 at the date change, I'm okay with -5 to +5. So 11:55 to 12:05 is okay with me. It's super difficult to get it to transition over at 12 o'clock exactly. If you're having trouble doing that, just know that there are different tolerances when it comes to the actual movement itself. So even though you install them very closely, there's a chance that it will happen ±5 minutes, and I would leave it well enough alone, in my opinion. So the second hand is on now. You saw me push in the crown. I'm just making sure now that everything is clearing and none of the hands are going to foul each other. I know that the hour and minute hand are good, but now that I installed the second hand, I just want to make sure that it is not going to stop by hitting that minute hand. I know just by building a few watches by now that it is clear. As you can see, I'm spinning it around pretty quickly, and there's no hitting of the second hand, and the second hand runs freely, but let it run its course around. Now we're ready for the crown installation, and you have to find a small piece on the movement. I'm pointing to it here, where the actual release of the crown and the crown stem is going to be. Once you find that, press it down, remove it. Just make sure that you're not compromising any of the hands, because remember, they're installed but they are exposed. So I kind of hold it up a little bit, hit that little lever, crown comes out, at least the temporary crown comes out, and then I'm ready to receive the actual movement and dial and hands to the case itself. This is where you want to do a very thorough cleaning to the dial and to the case itself. This is when you're going to do the installation of the case. Hopefully you don't have to remove it any longer after this point. But that being said, you want to make sure that any dust particles sitting within the case, sometimes they sit on the rehaut and you just can't see it well enough. So spend additional time, put the crystal up to some clear lighting, make sure you're looking through that crystal in a lot of angles, and that you blow off the actual dial in the hands a tremendous amount of times, because I can't tell you guys how many times I've installed a movement and then after which I found lint or dust on the dial itself, and then you've got to remove the actual movement and it becomes a headache and everything else. So I pushed in the movement here to make sure that it's sitting within flush. I'm also casing it. Even though I have to get back into it, I just want to make sure that I'm able to put the case back and there's no interference. So now we have to get the crown stem cut into the permanent crown, and the way that you figure out how much material to take from that crown stem is you temporarily install it onto the crown. We're going to glue it once we're done cutting it, but I want to show you guys exactly how to measure that out. So we get the crown stem to the crown, then we install that into the watch itself, after which you'll be able to measure and see how much of that crown stem that you actually have to cut off. Now, when you're cutting the material for the crown stem to make the crown flush to the case, you always want to cut less than more, because you could always cut additional material off of that stem, but you can't add it on, and then you're going to have to order additional parts. So you want to measure twice, cut once. Try to cut a little less. You can file down the stem as well if you're very, very close and you don't want to clip off too much. You could take the time and just file down the end of it just to make sure you don't take off too much material. After sizing that crown stem just right, you want to use some kind of glue. I like to pour it out on a little dish, and then I like to bring the actual end of the cut part of the stem into that glue, and then I screw that into the crown itself to secure that. Wait about 5 minutes for it to dry completely, and then install it back into the watch itself and make sure that it still actually fits the size and everything. All of the functions are able to be used without any issues, including screwing down the crown all the way. After that is completed, we're ready to get the case back on there permanently. But before we do that, I like to grease the gasket to ensure its water seal and its actual longevity over time, because once these seals dry out, they tend to crumble, they tend to crack, they tend to lose their actual longevity. So I like to take the opportunity to re-grease it, even though it's an actual brand new gasket itself. After which we get the case back on. Now, it's not important for you to get this super tight. You want to give it a little bit of a tightness, but nothing too crazy. After that case back is on, you're ready to go. I just would mess around with the hands, make sure everything is still functioning correctly, make sure that you did in fact get all the dust out, everything is functioning the right way, the date wheel is turning over still, the second hand is running without issue, you're able to screw that crown down all the way without the movement stopping. That would indicate that you haven't cut enough material out because there's too much tension. But if all that is good, you're ready to move on to the last step, which is getting on that bezel. So you have the click spring that just falls into two little holes to keep its place. I use the crystal press again, getting the right size to just around the bezel itself. That pops on and it gets secured. Once you pop that on, you'll hear a little bit of a pop. Don't get scared. Don't get nervous. That's just it falling into place. But you still want to be careful that you are not sitting that bezel on top of the crystal itself, so that cracking sound isn't the actual crystal. Once you hear that pop go on, you should be able to rotate it and you're ready for the bezel insert. Make sure that there's no back play. I usually give it a little tug to make sure that all of that is gone. Now, I installed this glue onto the bezel itself. I would have liked to have installed this onto the back of the bezel insert, which would have been extremely much easier for me to actually do that install. So you see me struggling at getting into there. Sometimes I just forget better processes, but I've already committed. So I use the back end of these tweezers to get it down. Then I peel off the non-stick side because it's a double side stick. But again, if you're doing this, I would use the actual bezel insert to install this on first, because it'll be a lot easier with no recession into the actual piece itself. That being said, when the glue is on there, you're ready to receive the actual insert. I'm double checking now just to make sure that there's no back play, and you just want to slowly line this up and make sure that it is going on there perfectly at the 12 o'clock, because if you ever had a misaligned bezel insert, this is the step where it gets messed up. So take your time before you do a final push down on that bezel insert. Make sure that it is completely lined up. And that's it. Here's the full build. These are the pieces that I've chosen. I chose a black bezel on a rose gold case. I, in fact, like it myself. My wife had other opinions. So the nice thing about having these Namoki mods is you can use different parts and mix and match things the way you want to. So I'm going to show you guys how the watch looks now after I completed it, but I wanted to show you what the offering was for the case and the pieces to it that Namoki is offering if you want to do this build. So up until this point, you've seen all the parts that came from Namoki specifically for this build. Now, the one thing that I love about watchmaking is you can interchange and have a lot of fun with these parts, and that's something that I had to do here. Now, my wife took a liking to the actual case and the whole entire build. The only thing that she didn't really like too much was that bezel and the bezel insert, so I had some parts laying around. I was able to swap them out to her liking, and it is a GMT bezel insert here. I understand that it doesn't really coincide with a three-hander build, but she really liked the colorway. She wanted to make it her own, and she actually added the Montrose strap to it, which is a very supple FKM. I'm a big advocate for Montrose straps. They make super supple and comfortable straps, and it's something that she does like to enjoy wearing on a day-to-day basis. So I wanted to give you guys a wrist shot of me wearing the watch, of her wearing the watch, and this way you guys can get the full effect of how it would be to switch out parts. With that being said, I appreciate you guys for spending your most valuable asset, which is time, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one.